Numbers never lied to me the way people did. That's what made them beautiful. That's what made them mine. My father, tech visionary, billionaire, and architect of the Thorpe digital empire, understood the elegance of mathematics better than anyone I'd ever known, except perhaps me. What he failed to understand was his middle child. I was neither Leon Thorpe Jr., his charismatic heir apparent, nor Ethan, his charming baby boy. I was Alexandra, Alex to the few who bothered to address me directly, the daughter whose mathematical mind mirrored his own in ways he was too blind to see. Until now. The distribution of assets will proceed according to Section 7, Subsection 12, with quarterly evaluations of qualifying activities and proportional allocations as defined in Appendix C. The lawyer's monotone voice droned on as I studied my brothers' faces across the mahogany table. Leon, ever the CEO in waiting at 34, maintained his boardroom composure, occasionally noting something on the pad in his leather portfolio. Ethan, barely 26 and perpetually underemployed despite his Stanford MBA, couldn't hide his impatience, checking his watch every few minutes. I sat motionless, absorbing every word of our father's trust document, my mind already detecting patterns where my brothers heard only legal jargon. 3 days earlier, Leon Thorpe Sr. had collapsed at his standing desk, dead before he hit the premium ergonomic flooring of his corner office. Heart attack, they said. No warning. The man who planned everything had apparently failed to plan for his own mortality at 62. Now we sat in the gleaming conference room of Thorpe Tower, listening to the mechanisms by which he would control us from beyond the grave. In conclusion, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses, the Thorpe Family Trust contains approximately $2.7 billion in assets, with operational control of Thorpe Technologies transferring to the board of directors, while financial distributions to the 3 Thorpe children will follow the algorithm outlined in Section 11. Algorithm? Leon interrupted, the word catching his attention as it had mine. What algorithm? The lawyer, Gerald Winters, my father's legal architect for 20 years, offered a thin smile. Your father was innovative in his approach to estate planning. Rather than traditional fixed percentages, he created a dynamic system that adjusts distributions based on various inputs. Inputs like what? Ethan leaned forward, suddenly engaged. Behavioral metrics, investment returns, public perception indicators, charitable activities, all weighted and measured quarterly. That's ridiculous, Leon said. You're saying our inheritance fluctuates based on some formula? Your father believed incentives drive behavior, Winters replied. The algorithm rewards actions he valued. I finally spoke. May we see the complete mathematical model? 3 pairs of eyes turned to me as if suddenly remembering I existed. I'm afraid that's not possible, Winters said. The algorithmic structure itself is proprietary and sealed by court order. You'll receive quarterly reports detailing how your actions affected your distributions. My brothers erupted in predictable outrage, but I remained silent, watching Winters carefully. There was something in his expression when he looked at me, a flicker of something almost like apology. As we left the building, Leon was already on his phone with his personal attorney, while Ethan complained loudly about the control-freak bullshit our father was pulling from the grave. I said nothing, thinking of the time I'd found my father at 3 a.m. coding in his home office. I was 16, unable to sleep until I'd solved a particular number theory problem. He hadn't noticed me watching from the doorway for nearly 10 minutes before I'd cleared my throat. Alex, he'd said, startled. It's late. I could say the same to you. He'd smiled then, a rare occurrence directed at me. Systems need maintenance when everyone's asleep. That's when you can make changes no one notices until it's too late. The memory lingered as I slipped into the back of my rideshare. My brothers might see only a cruel posthumous power play, but I knew better. My father had left us a puzzle, one I was uniquely qualified to solve. The first quarterly distribution came 3 months after the funeral. Leon received $2.1 million. Ethan received $1.7 million. I received $900,000. Leon was smug. Clearly, father valued my continued leadership at the foundation. Or my charitable gala, Ethan countered, referencing the lavish fundraiser he'd hosted, at trust expense, that had generated more publicity than donations. I said nothing about my paltry sum by comparison. Instead, I asked, did either of you receive the metrics report? They both looked blank. The report explaining how your distributions were calculated, I clarified. Leon frowned. Winters sent some spreadsheet. I forwarded it to my financial team. I nodded, having already spent hours analyzing my own report. The columns of numbers told a story my brothers couldn't read, a story of weighted variables and feedback loops. But the model itself remained hidden, the actual formula obscured. That night, I spread my materials across my apartment floor, printouts of trust language, my distribution report, financial news about Thorpe Technologies, family calendar events, social media metrics, even weather patterns on key dates. To anyone else, it would have looked like the work of a conspiracy theorist. To me, it was the beginning of reverse engineering my father's algorithm. Near dawn, I found my first clue in the timing. The quarterly evaluation had occurred precisely on the third-month anniversary of my father's death. But the distribution amounts didn't align with our activities on that exact date. They correlated more closely with behavioral patterns from the 6 days before. I remembered another late-night encounter with my father, years after the first. I was home from MIT for winter break, and he'd asked about my graduate research in predictive modeling. The problem with most predictive algorithms, I'd explained, is they weight recent data too heavily. Recency bias, he'd nodded. So how do you correct for it? Rolling averages with decay functions, but with deliberate pattern interrupts to test anomalous variables. He'd looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. 6 days, he'd said quietly. What? Nothing. Just, humans tend to perform consistently for about 6 days before behavioral drift sets in. I hadn't thought much of the comment at the time. Now, staring at the patterns emerging from my analysis, I understood. My father's algorithm wasn't evaluating us on quarterly performance. It was running continuous 6-day evaluations, with quarterly distributions reflecting these rolling windows. Which meant the system was watching us, always. More importantly, it meant I could predict it. Alex, I need your help. Leon rarely called me, and never with that edge of desperation in his voice. I muted the documentary I'd been half watching and sat up straighter. What's wrong? My second quarter distribution. It's barely a third of last quarter's. I feigned surprise, though I'd anticipated this outcome 2 weeks earlier based on Leon's public criticism of my father's final product innovation. What about Ethan? I asked. Even worse apparently. He's talking about contesting the trust. I suppressed a smile. That would be unwise. My own research had uncovered penalty clauses for legal challenges, not explicitly stated but embedded in the distribution mechanics. Will you look at my metrics report? You're good with numbers, and I need to understand what happened. Send it over, I said casually, already knowing what I'd find. After hanging up, I returned to my work, now sprawling across not just my living room but 2 additional monitors and a cloud server running continuous simulations. 3 months of obsessive analysis had yielded results. I couldn't see the complete algorithm, but I could predict it with increasing accuracy. My father had created a system that penalized exactly the behaviors he had seemingly rewarded during his lifetime: Leon's corporate arrogance, Ethan's public extravagance. Meanwhile, it subtly rewarded qualities he had never openly acknowledged in me: analytical patience, strategic thinking, and quiet competence. The irony wasn't lost on me. In death, my father was finally seeing me. When Leon's report arrived, I already knew what variables had triggered his reduction: his public statement about taking Thorpe in new directions, his dismissal of 2 long-term board members loyal to our father, his interview with Forbes where he'd implied our father had grown out of touch near the end. What Leon couldn't see, but the algorithm certainly could, was how these actions correlated with a 4% drop in stock price and declining employee retention metrics. I'll help you understand it, I promised when I called him back. But first, I need you to do something that might seem strange. By the third quarter, I had both brothers unwittingly dancing to my mathematical tune. Leon, following my insights into the trust mechanics, had publicly recommitted to our father's vision, reinstated one board member, and launched an employee retention initiative, all actions I knew would trigger positive weights in the algorithm. Ethan, desperate after his disastrous second quarter, had been even easier to guide. I'd suggested he scale back his public appearances and instead focus on smaller, more meaningful engagements with our father's favorite causes. I'd specifically directed him toward education initiatives in underserved communities, knowing from my analysis that the algorithm heavily weighted genuine impact over publicity. When the distributions arrived, both brothers saw substantial increases. Leon received $3.4 million, a record high. Ethan received $2.9 million. Their gratitude toward me was effusive and, I noted with mathematical detachment, the first genuine appreciation either had shown me in our adult lives. My own distribution had risen more modestly to $1.2 million, exactly as I'd planned. Drawing too much too quickly would trigger the algorithm's volatility safeguards. Patience was essential to my longer strategy. That night, I allowed myself a small celebration, an expensive bottle of Cabernet and a rare scroll through family photos. I paused on one from my college graduation, my father standing between Leon and Ethan, his arms around their shoulders, while I stood slightly apart, my summa cum laude honors cord barely visible in the frame. I took another sip of wine, remembering what he'd said when I'd showed him my thesis on adaptive algorithms. Impressive work, Alexandra. You've always seen patterns the rest of us miss. It was the closest he'd ever come to recognizing my abilities. I'd wanted to ask him then, why, if he saw my talent, did he never nurture it the way he had Leon's business instincts or indulged Ethan's creative whims? Why was I always peripheral, acknowledged but never centered? Now, studying the distribution patterns I'd mapped across my living room wall, I wondered if this posthumous puzzle was his answer, his way of finally putting me at the center. Or perhaps that was just the wishful thinking of a perpetually overlooked daughter. In the fourth quarter, I made my first deliberate move beyond merely understanding the system. Having mapped nearly 87% of the algorithm's behavioral inputs and correlation patterns, I began to manipulate scenarios that would trigger specific outcomes. I invited Leon to speak at a prestigious tech conference, knowing his natural inclination toward self-aggrandizement would emerge on such a platform. As expected, he couldn't resist taking primary credit for innovations that had been initiated under our father's leadership. The algorithm, with its continuous monitoring of public statements and media sentiment, responded precisely as my models predicted. Leon's distribution dropped by 22%. For Ethan, my manipulation required more subtlety. His educational initiative had generated genuine positive outcomes, children receiving coding education, scholarships awarded, opportunity expanding in concrete ways. The algorithm had rewarded this authenticity. You know, I suggested over coffee, with your success in education, you should consider expanding. Perhaps a Thorpe Institute for Technology Education? I watched his eyes light up at the prospect of naming something after himself. Our father had been strangely resistant to putting the Thorpe name on buildings. Weeks, Ethan had overextended his resources, diluting the impact of his original initiative while increasing administrative overhead. His distribution dropped by 31%. My own carefully calibrated activities, quiet contributions to open-source projects my father had valued, strategic investments in emerging technologies aligned with his vision, and targeted support of researchers working on problems he'd considered important, resulted in a distribution of $2.7 million. When both brothers called in panic, I expressed appropriate concern and confusion. The algorithm must be getting more sophisticated in its evaluations, I suggested. Perhaps it's time we coordinated our efforts more effectively. This was the critical juncture in my plan, bringing them into a formal alliance where I could more directly orchestrate the scenarios the algorithm would reward or penalize. Leon, ever the pragmatist, agreed immediately. Dan, financially strained from his overambitious expansion, had little choice. We're family, I reminded them during our first strategy session. Father would want us working together. The irony of using family loyalty as my lever didn't escape me. For 32 years, I had been the mathematical mind that neither my father nor my brothers had fully valued. Now, that same mind was quietly reshaping our family dynamics. By the sixth quarter, the distribution pattern had shifted dramatically. Leon received $1.8 million, Ethan $1.5 million, and I received $4.3 million. Neither brother connected this reversal of fortune to my subtle guidance of their actions. Instead, they became increasingly dependent on my insights into father's algorithm. On the second anniversary of our father's death, I visited his grave alone. The elegant granite headstone bore only his name, birth and death dates, and a line of code that would be meaningless to most visitors. To me, it was the initialization function of his first breakthrough algorithm, the one that had launched Thorpe Technologies decades ago. "I understand what you did," I said to the polished stone. "The question is why?" The wind provided no answer, but I didn't need one anymore. 2 years of immersion in his mathematical construct had revealed more than just distribution patterns. It had revealed his mind, perhaps more honestly than he'd ever shown it in life. The algorithm wasn't merely about money. It was about legacy, about ensuring that Thorpe values survived even if the Thorpe name did not. It rewarded innovation over imitation, substance over appearance, strategic patience over impulsive action. All qualities I possessed that my brothers did not. "You could have just told me," I said to the headstone. "You could have mentored me instead of testing me," but that wasn't who my father had been. He didn't give answers, he created conditions for others to find them. My phone vibrated with a text from Leon. "Where are you?" "Winters called an emergency meeting." I smiled. "Right on schedule." "This is unprecedented," Gerald Winters said, looking uncomfortable as he distributed 3 sealed envelopes across the conference table. "In my 40 years of estate law, I've never seen anything like it." Leon and Ethan exchanged worried glances. I maintained a neutral expression, though my heart raced with anticipation. According to the trust instrument, Winters continued, if certain pattern conditions were met for 6 consecutive quarters, a secondary protocol would activate. "What pattern conditions?" Leon demanded. Winters glanced at his notes. "The trust doesn't specify. It merely indicated that if the pattern occurred, I was to distribute these letters and execute the final distribution amendment." "Final distribution?" Ethan's voice cracked. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said quietly, "that the test is over." Both brothers turned to me, confusion evident in their expressions. "What test?" Leon asked. "Open your letters," I suggested, already breaking the seal on mine. Inside was a single page with my father's distinctive handwriting. "Alexandra, if you're reading this, then you've done what I always believed you could, you've decoded the system. You've reverse-engineered my algorithm and used it exactly as I would have. I recognized your mathematical gift early. It mirrored my own in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. I kept you at a distance not because I valued you less, but because I valued you differently. Your brothers needed my guidance. You needed freedom to develop abilities that surpassed my own. The algorithm was never about money. It was about identifying which of my children truly understood systems thinking, the foundation of everything I built. By the time you receive this, the trust will have been restructured according to the final distribution amendment. The details don't matter. What matters is that you've proven yourself the true inheritor of my legacy, not just my wealth, but my way of seeing the world. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this in person. Some lessons can only be learned through discovery. With pride, Dad." I looked up to see Leon and Ethan staring at their own letters, faces pale. "What does yours say?" Ethan asked hoarsely. I shook my head. "That's between father and me. Just as yours is between him and you." Winters cleared his throat. "The final distribution amendment activates a restructuring of the Thorpe family trust. Operational control of all trust assets will transfer to Alexandra Thorpe, effective immediately." Leon stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. "This is insane. She manipulated us, manipulated the system somehow." That's exactly what she was supposed to do, Winters replied calmly. Your father's instructions were explicit. The algorithm was designed to be decoded by whichever of his children demonstrated the necessary analytical skills and strategic patience. A test, Ethan whispered, rereading his letter. It was all a test. No, I corrected, finally understanding completely. It was an education. As the meeting dissolved into legal explanations and my brother's alternating anger and bargaining, I remained still, my father's letter warm in my hands. The ultimate elegance of his design was now clear. The algorithm hadn't just redistributed wealth, it had redistributed power based on demonstrated ability. And in doing so, it had shown my brothers what they had never seen before, the value of the sister they had overlooked. 3 months later, I sat at the head of the boardroom table, reviewing quarterly projections with the Thorpe Technologies executive team. Leon and Ethan were notably absent, Leon having taken a sabbatical to reconnect with his entrepreneurial roots, and Ethan surprisingly embracing his educational initiative with renewed purpose, albeit with more realistic parameters. The trust now operated on new terms, ones I had designed with greater transparency than my father's original algorithm, but no less strategic vision. Both brothers received generous fixed incomes but had to earn their influence through demonstrated competence. After the meeting, I returned to my father's former office, now mine, and turned to the panoramic view of the city. His presence still lingered here, in the meticulous organization of the bookshelves, in the faint smell of the sandalwood cologne he'd worn. On my desk sat a framed email printout, the only communication I'd saved from my undergraduate years. A response to a paper I'd sent him on algorithmic fairness. Alexandra, impressive work. The true test of any system isn't just its efficiency, but whether it properly values what matters most. Something to consider for your future work. LT. I hadn't understood then what he meant. I did now. The algorithm he'd created hadn't been perfect, no system designed by humans could be. But it had accomplished what he intended, it had revealed truth through mathematics. It had forced a reckoning with reality that no amount of family therapy or heartfelt discussions could have achieved. My father had never been good with emotional expression or verbal affirmation. But in his own way, through lines of code and weighted variables, he had told me I was seen. I was valued. I was his true inheritor. Numbers never lied to me the way people did, that's what made them beautiful. Please like and subscribe for more great revenge and family drama videos.